I still remember the exact sound the old barn door makes at dawn, that low, dragging creak I've been meaning to fix for 30 years. Dorothy always said I'd get to it eventually. She said that about a lot of things. She was right about most of them. About that door, I never did get around to it. Now I leave it the way it is on purpose, because every morning when the wind catches it just right and it groans open about halfway, it sounds enough like her to make me stop what I'm doing and listen. My name is Walter Gaines. I am 67 years old, and I have lived on this farm outside of Clarksburg, Virginia, my entire life. My father built the main house in 1959. I added the back porch in 1988. Dorothy planted the vegetable garden along the east fence the year we got married, and every spring since she passed, I tend it the same way she taught me, with the same heirloom tomato seeds she kept in a mason jar on the kitchen shelf. There are people who look at a piece of land and see acreage and dollar signs. I look at this farm and I see the whole shape of my life. I should have seen what was coming sooner. Looking back now, the signs were all there. But when it's your own son, you give him the benefit of the doubt. You keep waiting for the boy you raised to show up again. You wait longer than you should. It started about 8 months after Dorothy died. My son started calling more. I want to be careful how I say this, because there is nothing wrong with a son calling his father more often after his mother passes. That is what decent people do. But the calls had a particular quality to them, a certain careful tone, like a man interviewing someone for a job and already knowing he's going to turn them down. He would ask if I'd eaten properly, whether I'd been sleeping, whether the drive to town felt too long. Reasonable questions, caring questions. Except they weren't really questions. They were inventory. His wife was the one who first used the phrase cognitive decline. She said it the way people say it when they've been practicing slowly, with space around it, as if the words themselves are doing something clinical just by being spoken out loud. We were sitting at my kitchen table, the three of us, and she had her hands folded in her lap the way she always does when she's made up her mind about something. I noticed she was looking at the kitchen the whole time she was talking, not at me, at the room. I told her I hadn't declined anything. She smiled in that particular way that means she disagrees but has decided not to argue just yet. They started coming down from Roanoke more frequently after that, every second or third weekend. My son would walk the property with his hands in his pockets, quiet and measuring. He'd stand at the fence line looking south toward the creek and the lower pasture, and I'd watch him from the porch and I'd think about the boy who used to catch crawdads in that same creek and come home covered in mud and completely happy. That boy and this man in the pressed khakis felt like two different people. The first time they brought up selling, they framed it as something they'd been researching for my benefit. My son sat across from me at the dinner table and pulled out a printed sheet from a folder. He had a folder and explained that a senior living community 20 minutes outside of Roanoke called Meadow Ridge offered what he called independent living options for men in my situation. I asked him what my situation was. He said, gently, that living alone on 40 acres of farmland at my age was a significant liability. I told him I'd been living on this land my entire life and I'd managed not to die yet. His wife touched his arm, which meant let it go for now. They let it go for now. For about 3 weeks. My neighbor, Hank Morrison, came over that Sunday the way he usually does, with a 6-pack of whatever was on sale and no particular agenda. Hank is 69 and has the kind of face that looks like it was carved out of something durable. He was married to his wife Ruth for 41 years before she passed, and he and I have an understanding born from parallel grief that doesn't require much explaining. We sat on the back porch and I told him about the folder with the printed sheet and the phrase, significant liability. Hank opened a can and was quiet for a moment. You know what they're looking at when they look at this place, he said. I knew. I'd known for a while but hadn't wanted to name it. The farm had been appraised 3 years earlier for insurance purposes. Dorothy had made me do it. The number had surprised both of us. The lower pasture alone, Because of its creek access and the way the land lay flat before rising toward the ridge, was the kind of thing a developer looked at and saw a subdivision. There had been people over the years who'd sent letters, real estate companies, a land investment group out of Northern Virginia, one individual who showed up at the end of the driveway uninvited and introduced himself as someone who worked with interested parties. I had sent them all away. What I didn't know, not yet, was that my son had already been in contact with at least one of them. I found out the way you find out things you weren't supposed to find by accident, and then all at once. He had left his work laptop at the house 2 visits back, called me from Roanoke to tell me he'd be back for it the following weekend. The laptop sat on the desk in the spare room for 9 days. I wasn't going to touch it. It wasn't mine to touch. But on a Thursday morning, the power went out for about 4 hours because of a line issue down the road, and when it came back, the laptop had apparently been cycling through a restart, and it opened on the desk with his email client already loaded on the screen. I stood in the doorway of the spare room for a long moment. I want to be clear. I read those emails. I know that might not reflect well on me. I read them anyway. There were 12 messages in a thread with a real estate development company called Sycamore Land Partners, based out of Charlottesville. The thread went back 11 months. 11 months before Dorothy was even gone a year. The language in those emails was the language of people making plans. There were references to the square footage, the creek access, the road frontage along the county route. There was a number. It was a significant number. There was also a line, in one of my son's messages, that I read 3 times before I believed I was reading it correctly. He had written, and I am paraphrasing because I am not going to reproduce the exact words from memory, that the primary obstacle remained the current occupant's refusal to cooperate, and that he was pursuing a legal avenue that would resolve the situation within the year. A legal avenue. I went to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat down at the table where Dorothy and I had eaten 38 years of breakfast together. The roosters were going outside. The barn door creaked. I sat there for a long time. The paperwork arrived 6 days later. My son had filed a petition in the county court to be appointed my legal guardian on the grounds that I was suffering from age-related cognitive impairment and was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, including the management and disposition of my property. I called Hank. He came over within the hour and sat across from me while I showed him the petition. He read it carefully, set it down on the table, and looked at me. "What do you need?" he said. I told him I needed a plan. I told him about the emails. "Can you document them?" he asked. The laptop was still in the spare room. My son hadn't come back for it yet, kept pushing the trip back for one reason or another. I photographed every email in that thread with my cell phone, every single one, dates, times, the name of the company, the name of the individual he was corresponding with, and the reference to the legal avenue. Then I made an appointment with a doctor I'd never seen before, not my regular doctor in Clarksburg, but a neurologist in Harrisonburg, 45 minutes away, who came recommended by a woman at my church whose husband had gone through something similar. I went alone, on a Tuesday, told Dorothy's picture on the dashboard that I'd explain later, and sat through 3 hours of tests that evaluated everything from my memory recall to my ability to identify the day of the week and draw intersecting shapes on a piece of paper. The doctor was a careful, methodical woman who didn't offer opinions until she had reasons to offer them. The results came back the following week. Cognitively intact across all standard measures. No indicators of dementia or impairment. She signed the paperwork and looked at me across her desk. "You understand this may not be enough," she said, not unkindly. "I understand," I said, "but it's a start." Hank had his own contribution. He'd been keeping an informal log for months without telling me, just dates and observations jotted in a small spiral notebook he kept on the kitchen counter. The day I fixed the water pump on my own. The day I drove to the county seat and back to sort out a property tax question. The Tuesday I'd helped him repair a section of his fence that had come down in a storm. He had dates and times. He had his own handwriting as evidence that a man who was supposedly losing his grip on reality had, in fact, been functioning with complete independence for the entire period his son was claiming otherwise. Hank handed me the notebook without ceremony. "You do the same kind of thing for me someday," he said. "I hope I never have to," I said. "Me too," he said. My son called 2 weeks after the petition was filed. His voice had that same careful quality, the job interview tone, except now there was something underneath it, a kind of suppressed urgency that he was working hard to keep out of his words. He said he was sorry if the process felt harsh. He said he and his wife had agonized over the decision. He said they loved me and just wanted to make sure I was taken care of, that this wasn't about the farm, it was about my well-being. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I had found a doctor who agreed with his assessment that I should be evaluated thoroughly, and that I was looking forward to presenting those results. There was a pause on his end. "Dad," he said, "you don't need to fight this." "I know I don't need to," I said. "I'm choosing to." He came down the following Saturday, alone, without his wife. He knocked on the door instead of coming in the way he always used to, which told me everything about where we were now. We sat on the back porch and he tried a different approach, warmer, more personal, the language of a son rather than a petitioner. He talked about how hard it had been watching me alone out here after his mother died. He talked about the responsibilities of the farm, the physical demands, the isolation. He talked about Meadow Ridge again, about how many people his wife knew who had parents there who were thriving. I let him talk. I poured him coffee and I let him finish, and then I said, as calmly as I could manage, that I had seen the emails to Sycamore Land Partners. The porch got very quiet. He set his mug down and didn't pick it up again. "Those were preliminary conversations," he said finally. "Nothing was decided." 11 months of preliminary conversations, I said. He didn't have an answer for that. He tried several and stopped each one before it got going. Outside, the barn door creaked in the morning wind and we both just sat there in the sound of it. "I need you to understand," he said at last, "that I genuinely thought." "I know what you thought," I said. "I'm not interested in what you thought. I'm interested in what you did. And what I'm going to do now is defend this farm in court, the same way your grandfather defended it and the same way your mother and I held on to it every year that things were hard. That's what this family does with this land. We hold on to it." He left without finishing his coffee. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in October. The leaves on the ridge were just turning, and the drive to the county courthouse was the kind of drive that under any other circumstances I might have enjoyed. Hank sat in the passenger seat and didn't say much but was present in the way that mattered. The courtroom was small and wood-paneled with high windows and a smell of old paper that reminded me of my elementary school. My son and his wife sat at the petitioner's table with a lawyer I didn't recognize, a compact man in a dark suit who had the quiet self-assurance of someone who won more often than he lost. I sat at the respondent's table alone. I had considered getting a lawyer. I had decided against it for reasons that felt important to me, partly stubbornness, partly the conviction that no one could speak to the facts of my life as clearly as I could, and partly because I had studied enough about Virginia guardianship law in the preceding weeks to know exactly what the burden of proof required and exactly how I intended to meet it. The judge was a man in his late 50s with a deliberate manner and the habit of writing things down before he spoke. He asked me at the outset whether I was certain I wanted to proceed without counsel. I told him I was. He noted it in writing, looked up, and told me to be seated. He had an expression that I couldn't quite read. I found out later it was something close to respect, but I didn't know that at the time. My son's attorney opened with a thorough and practiced presentation. He described a man who had become increasingly isolated following the death of his wife, who had refused medical attention, who had shown signs of paranoia and declining judgment. He used the word stubbornness as though it were a clinical symptom. He had 2 witnesses, a social worker who had spoken with my son and his wife but had never visited the farm, and a general practitioner in Roanoke who had reviewed a written description of my behavior but had not examined me. When it was my turn, I stood up and thought briefly about Dorothy, about what she would have said, which was probably something short and accurate and perfect that I would not have thought of on my own. Then I started talking. I laid out the medical report from the neurologist in Harrisonburg. I explained the qualifications of the doctor and the nature of the tests and the findings. I called that doctor to the standby phone. She had agreed to testify remotely, and she walked the judge through each test and each result with the same careful precision she'd shown in her office. The judge wrote a great deal during her testimony. I called Hank. He walked to the stand in his good boots and his good shirt, and he brought the spiral notebook, and he answered every question in the measured, honest way that Hank answers everything. He described what he'd seen over the past year. He described a man who fixed his own equipment, drove his own truck, managed his own finances, made his own decisions about the farm with full knowledge of what those decisions entailed. He described the man he had known for more than 30 years, including 30 years of watching that man be a husband and a father and a neighbor and a farmer with complete competence. The attorney for my son cross-examined Hank at some length and accomplished very little. Then I presented the photographs of the emails. I had printed them out at the library, all 12 pages, and I submitted them as evidence with an explanation of how they had come to be on an unsecured and accessible screen in my own home. The attorney objected to their relevance. The judge overruled him and read through each page in silence. The courtroom had gone very still. I watched my son's face while the judge read, and I thought about the boy at the creek with mud on his shoes, and I felt something I couldn't quite name, not anger, not satisfaction, something heavier than both of those. The judge set the papers down and looked at my son directly for the first time. "Counsel," he said to the attorney, "I'd like to understand the petitioner's relationship with Sycamore Land Partners prior to the filing of this petition." The answer that came back was careful and insufficient. The judge asked my son a direct question then, which was somewhat unusual and which he allowed because it was relevant to the question of motive. He asked my son when he had first contacted the development company. My son said it was simply due diligence. The judge wrote that down and did not comment on it further, which I think was more effective than any comment could have been. Closing arguments were brief. The attorney for my son said that regardless of what the emails appeared to suggest, the welfare of an elderly man living alone on a large rural property remained a legitimate concern. I said that the evidence demonstrated I was fully capable of making my own decisions about my welfare and my property, and that the petition before the court appeared to have been motivated not by concern for me but by financial interest in the farm, and that granting guardianship under those circumstances would not protect me but would instead place me and everything I owned at the disposal of people who had already been engaged in planning to sell it for 11 months before his mother's grave had grass growing on it. I hadn't planned to say that last part. It came out of something I hadn't fully looked at until that moment. I heard my voice shake slightly on the last few words and I sat down. The judge recessed for 20 minutes. When he came back, he dismissed the petition. He found me legally competent with full capacity to manage my own affairs. He noted in his ruling that the evidence raised serious questions about the true motivation behind the filing, and that the court was particularly troubled by the pre-existing relationship with a development company seeking to acquire the property. He stopped short of formal sanctions, but his language was pointed enough that the attorney thanked the court very quietly, and my son did not look at me when they stood up to leave. Hank shook my hand on the courthouse steps with both of his. "Dorothy would have loved this," he said. "She would have had better things to say than I did," I said. "Probably," he said. "But you did all right." My son called once, 2 weeks later. His wife didn't get on the line. It was a short call, uncomfortable for both of us, full of the kind of language people use when they are trying to apologize without quite saying they're sorry. I listened. I didn't fill in the silences for him the way I used to. When he was done, I told him I needed time. I told him this was not something that could be talked over and set aside. He said he understood. I don't know if he did, What I didn't expect, what I genuinely could not have predicted, was the phone call I got 10 days after the hearing from a number I didn't recognize with an area code I had to look up. It was from Chicago. The voice on the other end was young and female and slightly hesitant, the way people are hesitant when they're not sure of their welcome. "Grandpa," she said, "it's Callie. I don't know if you remember me." I remembered her. She was my son's daughter from his first marriage, which had ended when she was very small. She had come to Dorothy's funeral with her mother, quiet and dark-haired and serious in a way that Dorothy had remarked on afterward. She said, Callie had the eyes of someone who paid attention. She had been 16 at the funeral. She was 18 now, she told me, a first-year student at a college in Chicago studying environmental science. She had seen something online about the hearing, a local news item, small and dry, the kind of thing that gets picked up by a county paper and forgotten in a week. She had read it 3 times, she said. "I wanted to call," she said. "I wanted to say I'm glad you won." We talked for almost an hour. She asked about the farm, about the land, about the creek and the lower pasture. She asked about her grandmother's garden. She had a memory of it from the funeral just one afternoon walking along the east fence with Dorothy, who had explained each plant and each seed as though introducing her to old friends. She said she had thought about that afternoon more than once in the years since. I was quiet for a moment after she said that. "Your grandmother had a gift for making people feel like what they were looking at mattered," I said. "She made me feel like I mattered," Callie said. Near the end of the call, she asked, almost as an aside, whether I ever took on help at the farm. "Not paid help," she said quickly. She had a long break coming up in January, 3 weeks, and her mother's family was complicated and Chicago in January was brutal, and she'd been wanting to get out of the city and somewhere with actual land. She was studying soil and watershed ecology, and she had read about the particular kind of land along that part of the Blue Ridge, and she thought she was sorry if this was strange, but she thought she'd like to see it in person. "The creek floods in January," I told her. "I know," she said. I looked at the topography maps. The lower pasture drains into the secondary channel. It's actually a really interesting hydrological situation. I sat back in my chair. Outside the window, the last of the October light was going orange across the ridge, and the barn door had settled into its evening stillness. "I'll have the spare room ready," I said. "The one on the south side. It gets warm in the afternoon." She arrived on a Friday in January with 1 bag and a pair of rubber boots already caked with some other place's mud, which I found reassuring. She stood in the driveway and looked around at the farm the way someone looks at something they've been carrying in their imagination for a while, checking it against the real thing. Then she looked at me. "It's exactly how she described it," she said. I didn't need to ask who she meant. She stayed the full 3 weeks. We walked the lower pasture and she took notes and asked questions and told me things about the soil composition and the creek hydrology that I didn't know, which was both educational and somewhat humbling for a man who had worked this land for 40 years. She cooked occasionally and badly, which I told her, and she laughed about it without taking offense. She helped me rehang the barn door properly, and when it swung open the next morning in the wind, straight and quiet, I stood outside and listened to the silence and felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could easily measure. Hank came for dinner one evening and the 3 of us sat around the kitchen table until nearly 10 o'clock. He told her stories about Dorothy that I hadn't told, ones from before the farm, from the early years, from the time Dorothy had organized the whole county road maintenance committee and run it so effectively that the county came to her for advice for the next decade. Callie listened with her chin in her hand and her grandmother's eyes. The night before she left, she asked me if she could come back in the summer. She was thinking about a research project, she said, something involving creek restoration and native plant corridors, and this farm had what she needed in terms of both land and access. But then she stopped and looked at me directly. "That's not the only reason," she said. "I know," I said. "Okay," she said. I drove her to the bus station in the morning and watched her go, and then drove home on roads I had driven my whole life. Past fields I had watched change season by season for 67 years, back to the driveway and the house and the garden still sleeping under the frost, and the barn door which now hung level and true, and the chair at the kitchen table where Dorothy used to sit, and the mason jar of tomato seeds on the shelf. I put the kettle on. I looked at her picture. "We have company coming in the summer," I said. The kitchen was quiet in that particular way. Kitchens are quiet in early morning when they are warm and no one is asking anything of you yet. I thought about the farm, about my father who had built this house, about Dorothy who had filled it, about the court and the emails and the petition and the November morning. I had sat at this same table and felt something I thought might be the end of something. It wasn't the end. I know that now. It was just a chapter with a hard ending that turned out not to be the last one. I finished my coffee and went out to check the fence along the south pasture, the same fence I had checked every morning for as long as I could remember, and the cold air came off the ridge, and the light was doing what it does in early morning on that particular hillside, and I walked the property that was mine, that would remain mine, and I thought that Callie was right about the hydrology of the lower pasture, and that Dorothy had been right about almost everything, and that 67 is not the age I once thought it was, and that the barn door sounded much better now that it hung straight, and that there was more left to do than I had believed on the day that envelope came through the mail slot, and that was more than enough to keep walking.